historically without a problem to the fact that the evolutionist worldview is responsible for communism. Without the evolutionist worldview, Karl Marx would not have done what he did. Karl Marx tried to dedicate his book to Charles Darwin. Go look at the title page, Das Kapital, in his original one. He knew evolution was the motivating factor for communism. I think you'd find some creationists that have taken the fact that they think there is a creator in this universe. Somebody made this place. And they would say, because there is a creator, there must be some order and design to nature. There must be something, some ordering patterns to look for. Therefore, most of the science advancement in the 1600s, nearly all of those fellows were creationists who were looking for order in nature. Now, they were not all Bible-believing, independent Baptists like me. Some were, a variety of religions, but they were a creationist of some stripe. And they were looking for order in nature. There have been those in the name of Christianity that have done some horrible things. No question. They've said, well, the Jews are useless because they crucified Christ. But what effect does it have on our kids? If we teach our students that man is just an animal, we are a higher animal, but just an animal, there is no creator, you're never going to have to answer to anybody for what you do. There is no judgment day. Then what results can you expect? I think we are seeing in our society today the direct result of the last 30 years of teaching evolution. Crime is rampant, violence is rampant, unwed birth rates, divorce rates are skyrocketing, drug culture. I think much of that, now maybe not all of it, but the vast majority of that is attributable to the philosophy of evolution. Matter of fact, here are some charts of things that have happened since 1963.
Drug dealers even aware of the concept of evolution. That's absolutely unbelievable.
Now listen for a minute. The drug dealers, many of them are not aware of the fact that they are going to face God someday, that there is a judgment coming. If a fellow believes he's going to face God...
Rastafarian? Yeah, you remember Rastafarian? The Muslims believe there's a judgment day and they're blowing up people by the hundreds.
Oh, sure. But let me just show you what's happened in America. This is what's happened to sexually transmitted diseases since 1963 for teenagers. This is the chart, the graph of what has happened. Now, what's causing it? It's up to you to decide. You think about that. Here's what's happened to violent crimes in America since 1963 over the population growth. It's up 544%. Nobody argues with that. Crime is bad. It's happening, and it's happening more now than it ever has before, as far as we know. In America, it has.
And you're saying that that's caused by the teaching of evolution?
I'm saying what you believe determines how you behave. All right, well, let's take up where we left off. I found the population chart for those of you that were gone during the break. As we mentioned, the population information is really only fairly concrete for the last 2,000 years. But the evidence is that at the time of Jesus Christ, many censuses were taken. Herod took a census, that the world population was about 250 million. And so there is no conflict with population growth and the creationist model that man's only been here 4,400 years since that flood of Genesis time. And you're welcome to take a look at this.
I do have a question. Now you're talking about, is that the census, are you just talking about the census proper, or did we extrapolate to take into account the rest of the world?
Taking into account the rest of the world,
okay.
yeah. Most of the population encyclopedias will say world population was about 250 million at that time. Okay?
Okay, I have a question. You guys were talking about plate tectonics before. What do you think about pantheism? That the world was at one point, all the continents had belonged together and then they all fit together in one puzzle. And if it didn't exist, if it didn't take that long to get apart, how did Indians come to America before?
Okay, she has two questions. What about Pangea, and what about the Indians? I got to write this down because my memory is real short. What was the question again? Pangea and Indians. Indians in America, right. It is a fact. The Earth has plates that are moving some. There are cracks along those plates called fault lines. That we'll put in the fact column. The Earth has plates, they are moving some. Now, does that prove it has always been moving for millions of years? Or could it have just started moving 4,400 years ago at the worldwide flood? Could have been either way. There's no way to prove that scientifically. It is a fact that South America looks like it would fit with Africa. If you moved them together, they look like they would fit. Okay, here's a map of the world, of that part of the world. South America and Africa have a similar continental shape. Nobody argues with that. Now, does that prove they ever were together? Of course not. This building would fit with the library if you moved them next to each other, but it doesn't prove they broke apart 80 million years ago, right? That is not evidence at all. Pangea is taken on very sketchy evidence. The other thing they don't take into account, so they're moving. Well, maybe they started 2,000 miles apart, and after the flood, they've moved, 50 miles in the last 4,400 years. Also, if you remove the water from the ocean, there's dirt under there, okay? The continents are not lily pads floating on a pond. There is a solid crust to this earth which goes under the ocean also. So, they don't just move around that easily. Yes, they are moving a little bit. I say that's just leftover movement from the flood 4,400 years ago. And the earth is still experiencing a little bit of shifting, and some mountains are still going up, and there are still earthquakes and volcanoes, but that's leftover remnants of this disaster from 4,400 years ago. It is also a fact that the oceans have two distinct parts to them. We have what's called the abyss, the deep part of the ocean. 15,000 feet is the average depth. And then all around the continent is a continental shelf. A cross-section of the ocean, if you could imagine this in your mind, we're going to draw a cross-section. Now you got to understand that less than 1% of the ocean floor has been explored. Way less than 1%. I called the people in Washington, D.C. that make the maps and said, now these contours you have on the ocean floor, how much of that is science and how much is that interpretation? And the lady in charge said, well, we've explored less than 1%, so 99% of that is guesswork. But let's assume it's reasonable. I'm not going to argue with that. The ocean, here's the continents, then there's a continental shelf, and then it drops off into the abyss. This area is called the continental shelf right here, where the water is less than 1,000 feet deep. Most people say less than 1,000 feet is considered continental shelf. Then you have the continental rise down to the abyss, where it's 15,000 feet deep, as opposed to 1,000. If you lowered the oceans 1,000 feet, if you could remove 1,000 feet of water out of the oceans, the continents would become huge. All the continental shelves would be exposed. England would not be an island. England would be part of the mainland. The English Channel would just be a valley you would walk across. Actually, if the oceans were lowered by just 1,000 feet, the Indians could walk to America from either side. You could walk across Iceland and Greenland and Canada. It would all be connected by lowering the oceans. So, here's the creationist worldview of what happened. Go back to my timeline. 4,000 years ago, BC, the creation. 1,600 years later, the flood. After the flood, the ice caps were huge, all the way down to Kansas City, Missouri. If you trap that much water in the form of ice, you're going to lower the oceans considerably. So for the first couple of hundred years after the flood, the people were able to walk literally any place in the world.